The letter arrived on a cold morning, and by the time Eleanor Whitmore finished reading it, her hands would not stop shaking. Men were coming to take the house. Not next month. Not next week. Within 10 days, unless £4,000 appeared from nowhere, the Whitmore family would lose everything they owned. She stood in the drawing room with the paper crushed in her fist and stared at her father, who would not meet her eyes. Charles Whitmore sat slumped in his chair, a glass of brandy trembling in his hand, and for the first time in her 22 years, Eleanor saw her father look like a small, frightened boy. "How much do you owe?" she asked, though she already knew the number would be worse than she imagined. "More than I can say out loud," he whispered. Eleanor's younger brother Henry was only 14. Her sister Grace was just 9, still young enough to believe that grown-ups always found a way to fix things. Eleanor could not tell them the truth yet. She could not tell them that their father's gambling had swallowed the family fortune whole, coin by coin, over years of quiet ruin hidden behind polite smiles at dinner parties. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden her mother had planted before she passed away 5 years earlier. The roses were still blooming, unaware that the world above them was collapsing. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cold glass and made herself breathe. There had to be a way. There was always supposed to be a way. That evening, her father's oldest friend, Lord Edmund Carow, arrived unannounced, his carriage rattling up the drive as though he owned the road itself. Eleanor did not trust him. He had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes, and every time he visited, her father grew paler and more desperate. "I have found your solution," Edmund said, settling into the best chair in the house without being asked. "The Duke of Ravenscroft has expressed interest in taking a wife. He is wealthy beyond imagination, and he is willing to pay any debt attached to the woman he marries." Eleanor felt the room tilt. "You cannot be suggesting what I think you are suggesting," she said. "I am suggesting survival," Edmund replied. "Your father's creditors will not wait forever, my dear. And the Duke does not care about scandal or history. He only wants a wife who will stand beside him at events and ask nothing of his heart. It is, in every practical sense, the easiest bargain you will ever be offered." Eleanor wanted to refuse. Every part of her screamed that this was not a life, that marrying a stranger to erase her father's mistakes was not a solution but a sentence. But then she thought of Henry, who still had years of schooling ahead of him. She thought of Grace, who deserved a childhood untouched by fear. She thought of her father, broken and ashamed, unable to look his own daughter in the eye. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "Tell me about this Duke." Edmund's smile widened, and Eleanor felt a chill she could not explain. "Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscroft," he said. "Cold, private. Some say he has not smiled since his wife died 3 years ago. But his money is real, and his offer is real, and time, my dear Eleanor, is the one thing your family does not have." 3 days later, Eleanor found herself standing in the entrance hall of Ravenscroft Manor, waiting for a man she had never met, about to agree to spend the rest of her life beside him. The manor was enormous, all dark wood and tall windows, beautiful in a way that felt more like a museum than a home. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, watching her with painted eyes as she waited. When the Duke finally entered the room, Eleanor's breath caught, though not for the reasons she expected. She had imagined an old, unpleasant man, someone whose fortune had purchased him a young bride out of vanity. Instead, Alexander Blackwood was younger than she thought he would be, tall, with dark hair and eyes that looked as though they had witnessed more sorrow than any man his age should carry. He was handsome in a severe, unreadable way, but there was nothing warm in his expression, nothing that welcomed her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and even, "I understand you know why you are here." "I do," Eleanor answered, lifting her chin. "Then you understand this is not a romance. I require a wife for the sake of appearances and continuity. In exchange, your family's debts will be settled in full, and you will want for nothing material for the rest of your life. I will not pretend to offer you affection I do not possess. Is that acceptable to you?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment. There was something in the careful way he spoke, as though every word had been chosen to keep a wall standing between himself and the world. She wondered briefly what had built that wall so high. "It is acceptable," she said, "because I have no other choice. But I will not be treated as furniture in your house, Your Grace. I may be marrying you out of necessity, but I intend to be a person in this arrangement, not an ornament." For the first time, something flickered behind Alexander's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something closer to respect. "Very well, Miss Whitmore," he said. "We understand one another." The wedding was arranged within the week, quiet and quick, more paperwork than ceremony. Elinor wore a pale blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and she stood beside a man who felt like a stranger carved from stone, and she said the words that bound her life to his. There were no flowers thrown, no laughter, no tears of joy. Only the quiet finality of a bargain sealed. As the carriage carried her away from the small chapel toward Ravenscroft Manor, Elinor looked back once at the house she had grown up in, now safe because of the choice she had just made. Her father stood in the doorway, his eyes wet, his hand raised in a small, grateful wave. Henry and Grace waved beside him, too young to understand the full weight of what their sister had just given for them. Elinor faced forward again, toward the manor that was now her home, toward the husband who sat across from her in silence, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside as though she were not even present. She did not know in that moment that the man beside her carried a grief so deep it had turned him to stone. She did not know that behind his locked doors and guarded eyes lived the ghost of a wife and child he had lost, a wound he had never let anyone near. She only knew that she had traded her future for her family's safety, and that the road ahead of her was long, uncertain, and utterly unknown. The carriage wheels turned steadily beneath them, carrying her deeper into a life she had not chosen for love, but for survival. And somewhere beneath the cold quiet of the Duke's expression, something in him had already begun to notice her, though neither of them could have guessed how much that noticing would come to mean. Rain began to fall softly against the carriage window as the manor came into view, its towers rising dark and silent against the gray evening sky. Elinor pressed her hand against her chest, steadying her heartbeat, and reminded herself why she had come this far. For Henry, for Grace, for her father's second chance. Whatever waited for her behind those enormous doors, she would face it with the same steady courage that had carried her through every hardship before this one. The carriage came to a stop, and a footman opened the door, offering his hand to help her down into her new life. Elinor took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out into the rain, unaware that the coldest man in England was about to become the center of everything she had left to hope for. The first night in Ravenscroft Manor felt longer than any night Elinor had ever known. A maid named Lucy showed her to a bedroom far from the Duke's own chambers, a room decorated in cool blues and silvers, beautiful but strangely empty, as though no one had truly lived in it for years. Elinor sat on the edge of the bed long after Lucy left, listening to the wind pressing against the windows, and wondered what kind of life she had just agreed to. She did not see Alexander again until breakfast the next morning. He sat at the far end of a table long enough to seat 20 guests, reading correspondence, barely glancing up when she entered. A servant pulled out her chair, and Elinor sat, arranging her napkin carefully, unsure whether she was meant to speak first. "Good morning," she said finally, when the silence stretched too long to bear. "Good morning," Alexander replied, not lifting his eyes from the letter in his hand. Elinor studied him across the impossible distance of polished wood and silver. He was dressed impeccably, every button fastened, every hair in place, and yet there was something exhausted beneath his composure, something she recognized because she had seen it in her own father's face during the darkest months after her mother died. Grief did that to people. It hollowed them out from the inside while leaving the outside perfectly arranged. "I have business in town today," he said, folding the letter and setting it aside. "Mrs. Fairweather will show you the house and explain how things are managed here. You may make whatever changes you wish to your rooms. Beyond that, I ask only that you conduct yourself with the dignity expected of a duchess when we appear in public together. And when we are not in public, Elinor asked before she could stop herself. Alexander finally looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "Then you may do as you please, Miss Whitmore." "Your wife," Elinor corrected softly, "not Miss Whitmore any longer." Something passed behind his expression, quick and unreadable, before he stood and excused himself from the table without another word. Elinor watched him go, frustration and curiosity tangled together in her chest. She had expected coldness. She had not expected to feel so strangely stung by it. Mrs. Fairweather, the housekeeper, turned out to be the first genuinely warm presence Elinor encountered within those walls. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a brisk, efficient manner, and as she led Elinor through the manor's endless corridors, she spoke with the easy familiarity of someone who had served the family for decades. "You mustn't mind His Grace's manner," Mrs. Fairweather said as they walked past a long gallery of portraits. "He was not always so quiet. There was a time this house was full of laughter." Elinor slowed her steps. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Fairweather's expression softened with old sorrow. "That is not my story to tell, my lady, but in time, if you are patient, perhaps he will tell you himself." They passed through a wing of the house that felt different from the rest, colder somehow. The doors closed and the curtains drawn even in daylight. Elinor noticed a portrait near the end of the hallway, turned to face the wall instead of hanging properly like the others. She paused in front of it, curiosity pulling at her. "That room is not to be disturbed," Mrs. Fairweather said quickly, guiding her forward with gentle firmness. "His Grace's private study lies beyond it, and he prefers it left undisturbed." Elinor said nothing more, but she filed the moment away carefully, another small piece of the puzzle that was her husband. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Elinor rose early, walked the gardens before breakfast, and spent her afternoons exploring the manor's library, a vast room filled floor to ceiling with books that smelled of old paper and dust. She wrote letters to Henry and Grace, describing the house in cheerful terms so they would not worry, though she left out the loneliness that crept in each evening when the halls grew quiet and Alexander remained locked away in whatever business consumed him. She saw him only at dinner, where their conversations remained polite but distant, careful exchanges about the weather, about household matters, about nothing that mattered at all. Elinor began to notice small things about him despite his guardedness. The way his jaw tightened whenever a servant mentioned the West Wing. The way his eyes lingered a moment too long on the empty seat beside him at the head of the table, as though someone used to sit there. The way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence, lost in thoughts he never shared. One evening, unable to sleep, Elinor wandered down to the library to find something to read, only to discover a soft light spilling from beneath a door she had not noticed before, tucked behind a bookshelf at the far end of the room. Curiosity overpowered caution, and she pushed the door open gently. Inside was a small, private room she had not known existed, filled with children's toys arranged carefully on shelves, a rocking horse in the corner, a tiny dress laid across a chair as though waiting for someone who would never return to wear it. Elinor's breath caught in her throat. She understood in that instant more than words could have told her. "You should not be in here." Alexander's voice came from the doorway, low and strained, and Elinor turned to find him standing there, his face pale in the candlelight, something raw and unguarded flickering across his features before he could hide it away again. "I am sorry," Elinor said quickly, stepping back from the shelves as though she had trespassed on something sacred because she had. "I did not know. I did not mean to intrude." Alexander did not move for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the small dress across the chair. "My daughter's name was Charlotte," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She would have been 6 years old this spring." Elinor's heart broke quietly in her chest. "And your wife?" "Her name was also Charlotte," he said. "I named our daughter after her before either of them left me." He drew a slow breath, visibly forcing himself back into composure, rebuilding the wall Elinor had just glimpsed through. "I do not speak of this. I would ask that you do not either." "I would never," Elinor said softly, and she meant it completely. But Alexander, you do not have to carry it entirely alone. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time as more than an arrangement, more than a stranger bound to him by necessity. For a moment, something almost tender passed between them, fragile and unfamiliar. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, closing the door behind her gently as they left the small room together. "Good night, Alina," he said, using her given name for the first time since their wedding. "Good night, Alexander," she replied. She lay awake long after returning to her room, thinking not of the grand manner or the fortune that had saved her family, but of the small dress on the chair, and the broken man who had shown her, if only for a moment, the shape of the wound he carried beneath his cold exterior. Something had shifted between them that night, something neither of them had intended, and Alina found herself wondering, for the first time since her wedding day, whether this marriage might hold more than mere survival after all. Weeks passed, and the manor that had once felt like a museum of grief slowly began to feel, in small and unexpected ways, like a place Alina could breathe in. She did not push Alexander to speak of the small room again, but something between them had changed since that night. He began to seek her out at odd hours, finding reasons to walk with her through the gardens or to join her in the library when she least expected it. It was Mrs. Fairweather who first noticed the shift and said nothing, only smiling quietly to herself whenever she passed them together in the halls. Alina learned, in those weeks, the small details that made up the man beneath the title. Alexander preferred his tea without sugar, though he never refused a slice of the honey cake the kitchen prepared each Sunday. He read late into the night, his study lamp burning long after the rest of the house had gone dark. He had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was troubled, a small tell that Alina came to recognize before he ever spoke a word of what bothered him. She also learned that Lord Edmund Carow visited the manor more often than seemed necessary, always arriving with some excuse about business or old friendship, always watching Alina with an attention that made her skin prickle with unease. Alexander tolerated him with a coolness that suggested he did not fully trust the man either, though he never explained why. "He was my father's friend before he was mine," Alexander said one evening, when Alina asked carefully about the connection. "I have never particularly liked him, but he has been useful in matters of business. I would advise you to be cautious around him regardless." "I already am," Alina admitted. "There is something about the way he looks at me that unsettles me." Alexander's expression darkened. "If he ever makes you uncomfortable, you are to tell me immediately. I will not have anyone treat my wife with disrespect in my own house." The protectiveness in his voice surprised her, warm and unexpected, and Alina found herself studying him across the drawing room with something that felt dangerously close to affection. Their days took on a gentler rhythm after that. Alexander began joining her for breakfast without needing to be reminded, and their conversations stretched longer, drifting from household matters into genuine curiosity about one another. Alina told him about her mother, about the roses she had planted before she passed, about the way Henry had once tried to build a boat out of the kitchen furniture and nearly flooded the entire ground floor. For the first time since their wedding, she heard Alexander laugh, a low, surprised sound, as though the noise itself had taken him off guard. "I cannot remember the last time I laughed like that," he admitted, still smiling faintly. "Then perhaps you have been keeping too much silence in this house," Alina said gently. "It does not have to remain so quiet, Alexander. Not unless you wish it to." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "I am beginning to think you might be right." Autumn arrived, painting the manor grounds in shades of gold and amber, and Alina found herself spending more afternoons walking the estate with Alexander at her side rather than alone. He showed her the old stables, where he kept a gray mare he had raised from a foal, and Alina discovered with quiet delight that he was gentler and more patient with the animals than with almost anyone else she had witnessed him speak to. "You are different out here," she observed, watching him stroke the mare's neck with careful affection. "Out here no one expects anything of me," he said simply. "No titles, no debts of duty. Only the horse, who does not care whether I am a duke or a stable boy. I do not expect anything of you either, Alina said quietly, not the things you fear I might. Alexander turned to look at her then, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft shifting of hooves in straw and the distant call of birds settling into the trees beyond the paddock. Alina felt something pull taut between them, fragile and uncertain, like a thread neither of them dared to tug too hard. Alina, he said finally, her name soft on his lips in a way that made her heart stumble. I did not expect, when I made this arrangement, that I would come to look forward to your company as I do. Nor did I, she admitted. I expected coldness. I expected to spend my days as a stranger in your house. Instead, I find myself wondering what you are doing whenever you are not near me, which is a foolish thing to admit to a man I only married a month ago. It is not foolish, Alexander said, stepping closer. I find myself doing the very same. The moment stretched between them, delicate as glass, and Alina thought, for one breathless heartbeat, that he might close the distance entirely. But then a groom called out from across the stable yard, requesting Alexander's attention on a matter concerning the horses, and the spell broke as quickly as it had formed. Alexander stepped back, clearing his throat, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he turned away. That night, Alina sat by her window long after the candles had burned low, replaying the moment in the stable yard over and over in her mind. She had come to this marriage believing it would be nothing more than an exchange, a debt repaid through duty and quiet endurance. She had not expected to feel her heart quicken at the sound of Alexander's footsteps in the hall, or to find herself smiling at the memory of his rare, unguarded laughter. She was beginning to fall for her own husband, a man she had married out of necessity rather than affection, and the realization frightened her nearly as much as it thrilled her. What frightened her more was the question she could not yet answer. Did Alexander feel the same pull she did, or was she mistaking kindness and loneliness for something deeper than either of them intended? Winter crept closer with each passing week, and the manor grounds grew bare and gray, though something warm continued to grow steadily between its two occupants, unspoken but unmistakable, like the first quiet signs of a fire catching before it truly begins to burn. Then, on a gray afternoon near the end of autumn, a letter arrived that would test everything Alina had begun to believe about her new life. It came from her father's solicitor, carrying news that made her blood run cold. Lord Edmund Caro had been seen making inquiries about the original terms of her marriage contract, asking questions that suggested he intended something far more dangerous than mere curiosity. Alina sat with the letter trembling in her hands, dread pooling low in her stomach, understanding with sudden clarity that the peace she had begun to find within these walls might not last nearly as long as she had hoped. Alina did not sleep that night. She sat with the solicitor's letter spread across her lap, reading the careful, worried handwriting again and again until the words blurred together. Lord Edmund Caro had been asking questions about the marriage contract, questions about whether the arrangement could be challenged, questions that made no sense unless he intended to profit from unraveling everything Alina had sacrificed to protect. She did not know whether to bring the matter to Alexander immediately or to wait until she understood more. Part of her feared that revealing Edmund's scheming might reopen old wounds, remind Alexander that their marriage had begun as a transaction rather than a choice made freely. But a larger part of her understood that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, had no place in whatever was growing between them. She found him in his study the next morning, the fire crackling low in the hearth, papers scattered across his desk in the organized chaos of a man who worked too hard and rested too little. "I need to speak with you about something troubling," Alina said, closing the door behind her. Alexander looked up immediately, setting down his pen. "What has happened?" She handed him the letter without preamble, watching his expression darken as he read it, his jaw tightening in the way she had come to recognize as barely restrained anger. "He has no right," Alexander said finally, setting the letter down with controlled precision, though his hand trembled slightly with the effort of restraint. "The contract is sound. There is no legal ground for him to challenge it." But I do not like that he is asking these questions at all. Edmund Caro does nothing without purpose, and his purposes are rarely honest. What could he possibly gain from unraveling our marriage? Elinor asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, calculating something Elinor could not follow. My father owed him money once, long ago, a debt I settled quietly to protect the family name. Edmund has resented me ever since for taking away his leverage over my father. If he could find a way to void this marriage, to expose some flaw in the contract or claim some impropriety, he could demand a settlement from me to remain silent, or worse, he could attempt to claim your family's original debts were never truly resolved. Elinor felt the blood drain from her face. My father, Henry, Grace, if the marriage were somehow voided. It will not be, Alexander said firmly, crossing the room to stand before her, his hands settling gently on her shoulders in a gesture that felt entirely new between them. I will not allow it. Whatever Edmund is planning, I promise you, Elinor, your family will remain protected. This is not merely a contract to me any longer. Surely you understand that by now. The sincerity in his voice, the steady warmth of his hands, the way his eyes held hers without flinching, told Elinor more than his words alone could have. Something had shifted permanently between them, and neither pretended otherwise any longer. I believe you, she said softly. But I am frightened all the same. Then let us face it together, Alexander said. You are not alone in this house, Elinor, not any more. Over the following days, Alexander moved with quiet efficiency to secure the marriage contract against any possible challenge, consulting his own solicitors, and ensuring every document was airtight beyond dispute. He also began making careful inquiries of his own into Edmund Caro's recent activities, uncovering a trail of mounting debts and desperate financial schemes that suggested the man's interest in the Whitmore marriage was born of pure desperation rather than any legitimate grievance. Elinor watched Alexander work with a new appreciation for the man beneath the title, someone who, despite his guarded nature, fought fiercely for those under his protection. She began to understand that his coldness had never been indifference. It had been armor, built carefully over years of loss, and piece by piece, she was watching it come undone in her presence. One evening, as the household settled into quiet after a long day of tension, Elinor found Alexander standing alone by the drawing-room window, watching the last light fade over the gardens. She approached quietly, standing beside him without speaking, simply sharing the silence. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for standing beside me in this. I know you did not ask for any of this trouble when you agreed to marry a stranger." Alexander turned to look at her, and something in his expression had softened entirely, the careful distance he once kept now nowhere to be found. "I did not ask for it," he agreed. "But I find, Elinor, that I would face far worse than Edmund Caro if it meant keeping you safe." Her heart stumbled at the words, at the quiet conviction behind them. "Alexander." "I know this began as an arrangement," he continued, his voice low and unguarded in a way she had never heard before. "I know I promised you I would ask nothing of your heart, but I find I cannot keep that promise any longer because somewhere in these past weeks you have become far more to me than a wife of convenience. You have become the first person in 3 years who has made this house feel like something other than a tomb." Elinor's breath caught. She had wondered, hoped, feared she was imagining the warmth growing between them, and here he was, laying it plainly before her, vulnerable in a way that must have cost him greatly to offer. "I feel the same," she admitted. "I did not expect to. I came here believing I was trading my future for my family's safety, and instead I find I am falling for the very man I thought I would spend my life quietly enduring." Alexander reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we have both been given something neither of us expected to find." Neither moved closer that night, though the air between them felt charged with everything unspoken, a promise of something neither was quite ready to name aloud. But as Elinor climbed the stairs to her room that evening, she felt lighter than she had in months, buoyed by the knowledge that whatever Edmund Caro was scheming, Whatever threats waited beyond the manor's walls, she would not face them alone. She had found in the coldest man in England a warmth she had never expected, and she intended to protect it as fiercely as he protected her. Yet even as hope bloomed quietly between them, the threat of Edmund Caro's schemes had not disappeared. Somewhere beyond the manor's gates, a dangerous man was gathering the pieces of a plan that would soon force Elinor and Alexander to prove, beyond any doubt, exactly how far they were willing to go for one another. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the northern hills with a bitterness that froze the fountains in the manor garden solid and dusted the countryside in unbroken white. Elinor had grown to love the season despite its harshness, finding a strange peace in the quiet stillness of snow-covered grounds, but this particular winter would test her in ways she had never imagined. It began with a cough that would not fade. Elinor dismissed it at first as nothing more than the change of season, refusing to worry Alexander over something so small when he already carried the weight of Edmund Caro's schemes upon his shoulders. But the cough worsened over the following days, deepening into something that left her breathless and pale, until one morning she woke unable to rise from her bed at all, fever burning through her like a fire she could not control. Mrs. Fairweather found her first, alarmed by Elinor's absence at breakfast, and the housekeeper's cry brought Alexander running through the halls faster than any servant had ever seen him move. He arrived at Elinor's bedside to find her flushed and trembling, her breathing shallow, her eyes glassy with fever, and something in his composed, careful world shattered entirely at the sight of her. "Send for the physician immediately," he ordered, his voice sharp with a fear the household had never heard from him before. "And do not leave her side until he arrives." The physician arrived within the hour, his expression grave as he examined Elinor, murmuring words like fever of the lungs and dangerous complications that made Alexander's blood run cold. He prescribed rest, warm broths, and careful watching through the night, warning that the coming days would determine whether her body could fight off the illness on its own. Alexander did not leave her side. He dismissed every offer from the household staff to take a turn watching over her, insisting on remaining in the chair beside her bed himself, holding her hand through the worst of the fever, pressing cool cloths to her forehead when the heat became unbearable, speaking softly to her even when she was too lost in delirium to respond. "You cannot leave me now," he whispered one night when her fever spiked dangerously high and her breathing grew ragged and uneven. "Not now. Not when I have only just found you. I have already buried one wife, Elinor. I cannot bury another. Do you hear me? You must fight." Mrs. Fairweather, passing the door quietly with fresh linens, paused at the sound of the Duke's voice cracking with an emotion she had not heard from him in years, and she stepped away silently, leaving husband and wife to their private battle. The days blurred together for Alexander in a haze of fear and exhaustion. He barely ate, barely slept, refusing to leave Elinor's bedside even when his own body begged for rest. He spoke to her constantly, filling the silence with stories of his childhood, memories of his mother before she passed, quiet confessions he had never shared with another living soul, as though speaking might somehow tether Elinor to the world through the sound of his voice alone. He told her in the depths of one long, dark night about the fire that had taken his first wife and daughter 3 years earlier, about returning home too late to save them, about the guilt that had haunted him every day since, convincing him he was cursed to lose anyone he allowed himself to love. He told her he had built walls around his heart after that night, certain that loving again meant losing again, certain he could survive an empty life far better than another loss like that one. "But then you came into my house," he whispered, holding her fevered hand against his cheek. "And you did not let me hide behind those walls, Elinor. You saw through them from the very first day. I am not certain I know how to live without you now, and that terrifies me more than anything Edmund Caro could ever threaten." Elinor could not hear him, lost as she was in the depths of her fever, but something in his words seemed to reach her regardless. On the 4th night, her fever finally began to break, her breathing evening out, color slowly returning to her cheeks as the physician had promised it eventually would if her body proved strong enough. Alexander wept quietly at her bedside when the physician confirmed the worst had passed, the first tears he had allowed himself in 3 long years. Elinor woke 2 days later, weak but lucid, to find Alexander asleep in the chair beside her bed. His hand still wrapped around hers, dark circles beneath his eyes testifying to the days he had spent refusing to leave her. She watched him for a long moment, her heart swelling with a tenderness she had never expected to feel so completely, before gently squeezing his hand. Alexander woke instantly, his eyes flying open, relief flooding his features so completely that Elinor felt tears prick her own eyes at the sight of it. "You are awake," he breathed as though he could not quite believe it. "Elinor, you are truly awake." "I am," she managed, her voice hoarse but steady. "Though I understand from Mrs. Fairweather that you have not slept properly in days." "I could not," he admitted simply. "I could not bear the thought of closing my eyes and losing you while I was not watching." Elinor's throat tightened with emotion. "Alexander, I heard you, during the fever. I do not know how much was real and how much was dreaming, but I remember your voice, telling me about the fire, about your fear of losing anyone you love again." Alexander went still, searching her face carefully. "And does that frighten you, to know how broken I truly am beneath all of this?" "No," Elinor said firmly, lifting his hand to press it against her heart. "It makes me understand you. And it makes me love you all the more for finding the courage to let me in despite everything you have lost." The word love hung between them, spoken aloud for the first time, fragile and enormous all at once. Alexander's breath caught, his eyes searching hers as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. "You love me," he repeated softly, wonder threading through his voice. "I do," Elinor said, no hesitation in her voice despite her weakened state. "I have for weeks now, though I was too uncertain to say it aloud until this moment showed me how much I feared losing the chance." Alexander lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then let it be known, Elinor, that I love you as well. Completely and without reservation. You have given me back a part of myself I believed I had lost forever in that fire 3 years ago." As Elinor recovered slowly over the following days, the manor itself seemed to change around them, warmth returning to rooms that had stood cold and shuttered for years. Alexander had the small room behind the library reopened at last, not to erase the memory of his first family, but to honor it properly rather than hide it away in silence and shame. Elinor sat with him quietly one afternoon as he finally spoke of Charlotte and their daughter with something closer to peace than grief, and she understood that healing, like love, did not erase the past but made room for a future to exist alongside it. Word of the Duchess's illness and recovery spread through the county, and with it came a softening in how the household staff and local society regarded the once cold Duke of Ravenscroft. Whispers of his devotion during her illness reached even Lord Edmund Caro's ears, and though Elinor did not yet know it, this devotion would soon become the very thing Edmund attempted to use against them both. But for now, in the quiet warmth of her recovery, Elinor allowed herself simply to rest in the knowledge that she was loved, truly and completely, by a man who had once seemed made of nothing but ice and distance. The garden beyond her window, still blanketed in snow, seemed somehow less bleak now, promising that spring in every sense was finally on its way. Spring returned to Ravenscroft Manor slowly, melting the snow from the gardens and coaxing the first green shoots up through the softened earth. Elinor's strength returned with the season, color blooming back into her cheeks, and with her recovery came a new lightness between her and Alexander that neither of them tried to hide any longer. The household staff noticed it in the way the Duke now sought his wife out for every meal, in the way laughter had returned to rooms that had stood silent for years, in the way Mrs. Fairweather hummed softly to herself while arranging fresh flowers throughout the manor for the first time since the old Duchess had passed. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of amber and rose over the estate, Alexander found Elinor in the garden, kneeling beside the same rose bushes that had first caught her attention months earlier when Mrs. Fairweather had shown her the grounds. She was carefully tending the new growth, her sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged across her hands, utterly unconcerned with appearing anything less than perfectly composed. And Alexander thought, not for the first time, that he had never seen anything more beautiful. "You have transformed this garden," he said, approaching quietly. Elinor looked up, smiling as she brushed a strand of hair from her face, leaving a faint streak of soil across her forehead that Alexander found utterly endearing. The garden was already beautiful. I have simply given it a little attention it was missing. "That seems to be a habit of yours," Alexander said softly, kneeling beside her among the roses. "Giving attention to things that have been quietly neglected for far too long." Elinor understood immediately that he was not speaking only of the garden, and her heart softened at the quiet vulnerability in his voice. "Is that what I have done for you, Alexander?" "You have done far more than that," he said, reaching out to gently wipe the smudge of dirt from her forehead, his fingers lingering against her skin. "You have given me back a life I believed I had buried alongside Charlotte and our daughter. You have taught me that loving again does not mean forgetting what came before, only making room for something new to grow beside it, the same way these roses grow each spring regardless of the frost that came before them." Elinor felt tears gathering in her eyes, though they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "Alexander, these past months with you have given me more than I ever expected when I agreed to this marriage. I came here believing I was sacrificing my future for my family's safety. Instead, I found the truest happiness I have ever known." Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew a small, delicate box, his hands, usually so steady and controlled, trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a ring set with a single sapphire, deep blue and luminous in the fading light. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said. "I want you to have it, not as a symbol of the contract that first brought us together, but as a promise of everything I intend to give you freely from this day forward for the rest of our lives." "Alexander," Elinor breathed, overwhelmed. "I know we are already married," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I know the ceremony has already taken place, the vows already spoken, but those vows were made by two strangers bound by necessity. I want to make new ones now. Elinor, as the man who has fallen completely and irrevocably in love with you, promises made freely with my whole heart, rather than out of obligation." He slid the ring onto her finger, and Elinor found she could not speak past the emotion tightening her throat, so she simply reached up and cupped his face in her hands, drawing him closer until their foreheads touched, sharing the same breath in the quiet garden between them. "I accept your promise," she finally managed, "and I offer you the same in return. Whatever comes, Alexander, whatever challenges Edmund Caro or anyone else attempts to place before us, I choose you, not out of necessity. Out of love, freely given and freely returned." Alexander closed the remaining distance between them then, his lips meeting hers in a kiss unlike anything Elinor had ever experienced, slow and searching at first, as though he were memorizing the shape of her mouth against his, before deepening into something far more certain, far more claiming. It was not the kiss of a man fulfilling an obligation or maintaining appearances for society's sake. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 3 years locked away in grief, finally allowing himself to feel something whole and unbroken again, finally allowing himself to come home. Elinor melted into him, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms, a heartbeat that belonged in this moment and every moment after entirely to her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers once more, his eyes closed, a soft, genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile Elinor had rarely seen from him before this moment. "I have spent 3 years believing I would never feel this way again," he murmured. "That I did not deserve to after failing to save Charlotte and our daughter. But you, Elinor, you have shown me that love does not punish us for surviving. It simply asks us to be brave enough to open our hearts once more." "You did not fail them," Elinor said gently, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. "A fire took them from you, Alexander. That was never your fault, no matter how deeply you have carried that guilt. And I believe wherever they are now, they would want nothing more than to see you happy again." Alexander's eyes glistened with unshed tears. But for the first time, they were not tears of grief alone, but tears of release, of a burden finally beginning to lift after 3 long years of solitary suffering. He pulled Alina into his arms, holding her close as the last light of sunset faded into the soft blue of evening. And for a long while, neither of them spoke, content simply to exist together in the quiet peace of the garden, surrounded by roses that bloomed brighter than they had in years. As they finally made their way back toward the manor, hand in hand, the windows glowing warm with candlelight against the darkening sky, Alina felt, for the first time since her mother's passing years earlier, that she had truly found a home again, not simply a house of stone and grandeur, but a place where she was known, cherished, and loved exactly as she was. Whatever trials still awaited them beyond the safety of the garden walls, she knew now, with unshakable certainty, that she would face them with Alexander at her side, not as a stranger bound by contract, but as a man who had chosen her freely, completely, and forever. Yet even as their happiness bloomed alongside the spring roses, a darker shadow continued to gather at the edges of their peace. Lord Edmund Caro had not abandoned his schemes simply because the Duke and Duchess had fallen in love. If anything, the strength of their bond now gave him precisely the leverage he had been searching for, and within days, his plan would finally reveal itself in a manner neither Alina nor Alexander could have anticipated. The invitation arrived on a bright morning in early summer, embossed in gold lettering, requesting the presence of the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft at a grand gathering hosted by none other than Lord Edmund Caro himself. Alina felt an immediate wariness upon reading it, a sense that the timing was far too deliberate to be coincidence. "He has never hosted such an event before," Alexander said, turning the invitation over in his hands as though searching for some hidden meaning within the paper itself. "Edmund does not spend money he does not have unless he expects a substantial return on the expense." "Do you think he means to confront us publicly?" Alina asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "I think," Alexander said slowly, "that we must attend and discover his intentions ourselves, rather than allow him to strike without warning. It is better to face this directly than to spend our days waiting anxiously for whatever he is planning." The evening of the gathering arrived, and Alina dressed carefully in a gown of deep emerald silk, the sapphire ring Alexander had given her catching the candlelight as she descended the manor's grand staircase. Alexander waited for her at the bottom, dressed in formal black, his expression unreadable but his eyes warm with unmistakable admiration as he watched her approach. "You look extraordinary," he murmured, offering his arm. "Together we shall face whatever he intends," Alina said firmly, though her heart pounded with nervous anticipation as they climbed into the carriage bound for Caro Hall. The gathering was extravagant beyond reason, far grander than Edmund Caro's modest fortune should have allowed, further confirming Alexander's suspicion that the man was drowning in debts he could no longer manage quietly. Alina felt eyes upon them the moment they entered the ballroom, whispers rippling through the crowd of curious guests, eager to witness whatever drama the evening might unfold. Edmund himself approached within minutes, his smile as unsettling as ever, though tonight it carried a sharper edge of triumph that made Alina's stomach twist with dread. "Your Grace, Duchess, how wonderful that you could join us this evening. I have been eager to make an announcement, and I felt it only proper that you both be present to hear it firsthand." "What announcement, Edmund?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension visible in his shoulders. Edmund raised his voice, addressing the gathered crowd with practiced theatricality. "I have recently come into possession of documents suggesting certain irregularities within the marriage contract between the Duke of Ravenscroft and his Duchess, formerly Miss Alina Whitmore. Irregularities that call into question the legitimacy of the debt settlement made on behalf of the Whitmore family." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Alina felt her blood run cold, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed, refusing to give Edmund the reaction he so clearly desired. "That is a lie," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the murmurs with quiet authority. The contract was drawn with the strictest legal precision. I would advise you to reconsider these claims before you damage your own reputation with slander. Would I lie in front of so many witnesses? Edmund asked, feigning innocence. I have documents, Your Grace, suggesting your solicitor falsified certain dates to expedite the settlement, an act that could see the entire marriage rendered invalid, along with the very substantial debt forgiveness your wife's family received as a result. Alina's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. If Edmund's claims held any legal weight, even falsely constructed weight, it could mean scandal severe enough to threaten both her family's restored security and everything she and Alexander had built together. She glanced at Alexander, searching his face for reassurance, and found him watching Edmund with a calm, calculating intensity that surprised her. "Produce these documents," Alexander said evenly. "Here, now. In front of these same witnesses, you have gathered to hear your accusations." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Edmund's face, quickly hidden behind his practiced smile. "I do not carry such sensitive materials to a social gathering, Your Grace. They are secured properly, as any legal matter requires." "How convenient," Alexander said, his tone sharpening with quiet menace. "You gather an audience to hurl accusations, yet you carry no proof to substantiate them. I wonder, Edmund, whether these mysterious documents exist at all, or whether this entire performance is simply a desperate attempt to extract money from a man you believe too proud to allow his family's reputation to be questioned publicly." The crowd's murmurs shifted, uncertainty rippling through the room as guests began to reconsider Edmund's claims in light of Alexander's steady, unshaken response. Edmund's composure cracked slightly, color rising in his face. "I assure you the documents are entirely real," he insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Then I shall expect them delivered to my solicitor by morning," Alexander said, "along with a full account of where you obtained them. I have already taken the liberty, Edmund, of investigating your recent financial dealings. I know of the debts you carry, the desperate loans you have taken against properties you no longer fully own. I suspect this entire scheme was born not of legal concern, but of financial desperation, and an attempt to force a settlement from me through public embarrassment." Edmund's face paled visibly. The crowd's attention now fully turned against him as murmurs of understanding replaced their earlier shock. Alina watched, admiration swelling in her chest, as Alexander stood firm and unshaken, defending not only his own reputation but hers and her family's as well, refusing to allow Edmund's desperate scheme to succeed. "You have no proof of any of that," Edmund said weakly, though the fight had visibly drained from his voice. "I have considerably more proof than you have offered this evening," Alexander replied calmly. "And I would remind you, in front of these same witnesses, that slander against a Duke and Duchess carries severe legal consequences. I would strongly advise you to withdraw your claims immediately, unless you wish to face those consequences directly." A tense silence stretched through the ballroom before Edmund, recognizing the crumbling of his own scheme before an audience that no longer believed him, offered a stiff, humiliated bow. "Perhaps I have been misinformed regarding certain details. I withdraw my earlier statements and offer my sincerest apologies for any distress caused." He retreated quickly through the crowd, his earlier triumph replaced entirely by public humiliation, and Alina felt the tension finally drain from her shoulders as Alexander turned to her, his expression softening from the controlled fury he had shown Edmund into gentle concern. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, taking her hand. "I am now," Alina said, relief washing through her. "Thank you, Alexander, for standing so firmly beside me tonight. I told you once that I would not allow anyone to threaten what belongs to me," Alexander said, his eyes warm despite the lingering tension of the evening. "That has never been more true than it is tonight, Alina. You are not merely my wife. You are the heart of this family now, and I will defend that with everything I possess." As they made their way back through the crowd toward their carriage, guests offering quiet words of support and admiration for the manner in which Alexander had handled the confrontation, Alina felt a profound sense of relief settle over her, not only because the immediate threat had passed, but because she had witnessed, in undeniable clarity, exactly how deeply Alexander was willing to fight for their life together. The carriage ride home passed in comfortable silence, Alina resting her head against Alexander's shoulder as the manor's familiar lights came into view ahead of them. Whatever schemes Edmund Caro might still attempt in his desperation, Alina understood now, with unwavering certainty, that she and Alexander would face them together, their bond far too strong to be shaken by any lie or manipulation he might still conjure. But Edmund Caro, humiliated and increasingly desperate, was not a man to accept defeat quietly, and as the carriage carried them safely home through the summer night, neither Alina nor Alexander could have known that his most dangerous move had not yet been played. A week after the humiliation he suffered at his own gathering, Lord Edmund Caro made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his failing schemes. Alina received word early one morning that her father, Charles Whitmore, had been summoned urgently to London on a matter concerning old debts Edmund claimed had never been properly settled. A final effort to reopen wounds Alexander had already closed through the original marriage contract. Alina's hands trembled as she read the letter, fear for her father's well-being overtaking the security she had only recently begun to feel. "He means to trap my father into signing something that could undo everything," she said, passing the letter to Alexander across the breakfast table, "or to threaten him into public disgrace if he refuses." Alexander read the letter quickly, his expression hardening with the same quiet determination Alina had witnessed at Caro Hall. "Then we shall go to London ourselves, immediately, and ensure your father signs nothing without proper counsel present. Edmund has shown his hand too many times now for me to allow him another opportunity to manipulate this family." They departed within the hour, the carriage racing along roads still damp with morning dew, Alina's heart pounding with worry for her father throughout the long journey. When they arrived at the modest London townhouse where Charles Whitmore had been summoned to meet Edmund, they found the older man seated across from Edmund in a dimly lit study, a stack of papers spread between them, Charles's face pale and uncertain as Edmund pressed him toward signing documents he clearly did not fully understand. "Father, do not sign anything," Alina said firmly, sweeping into the room with Alexander close behind her. Charles looked up, relief and confusion mingling across his features. "Alina, I did not expect you. Lord Caro said there were unresolved matters concerning the original debt, that I might face legal consequences if I did not address them immediately." "There are no unresolved matters," Alexander said, his voice cold and commanding as he stepped forward, placing himself protectively beside Alina. "Edmund, this scheme ends now. I have already spoken with the solicitors overseeing the original settlement. Every debt was cleared in full, properly documented, and legally binding beyond any challenge. You have preyed upon an old man's fear and confusion in a final, desperate attempt to salvage the humiliation you suffered at your own gathering, and I will not allow it to continue." Edmund rose from his chair, his composure finally shattering entirely under the weight of his failed schemes. "You do not understand the position I am in," he said, his voice cracking with genuine desperation now rather than calculated theatrics. "I owe considerable sums to men far less patient than either of you. I believed, if I could simply extract some settlement from this family, I might yet save myself from ruin." For a moment, something almost like pity flickered across Alexander's expression, though it did not soften his resolve. "Then you should have sought honest assistance rather than attempting to destroy an innocent family through lies and manipulation. I will not offer you the settlement you sought through deception, Edmund, but I will offer you this. Leave this family alone, permanently, and I will not pursue legal action against you for the slander you attempted at Caro Hall, nor for this latest attempt to manipulate my father-in-law into signing away his family's security." Edmund's shoulders sagged, the last of his fight draining away entirely. "And if I refuse?" "Then you will face consequences considerably more severe than public embarrassment," Alexander said evenly. "I have connections you cannot begin to imagine, Edmund, and patience I have already stretched thin on your behalf out of respect for whatever friendship you once shared with my father. That patience has now run out entirely." Edmund gathered the useless documents from the table with trembling hands, his earlier arrogance replaced completely by quiet defeat. "You will not hear from me again," he said stiffly, before departing the room without another word, his footsteps fading down the hallway and out of their lives entirely. Charles Whitmore sat heavily in his chair, relief and shame mingling across his weathered features as he looked between his daughter and the son-in-law who had just saved him from further disgrace. "I am sorry, Alina. I should never have allowed my own foolishness to place this family in such danger in the first place. You sacrificed your own happiness to correct my mistakes, and even now, you continue paying for choices I made." "Father," Alina said gently, kneeling beside his chair and taking his hands in hers, "I did not sacrifice my happiness. I found it in this very arrangement you feared had ruined my future. Alexander has become the truest partner I could have ever hoped for, and whatever difficulties brought us together, I would not trade the life I have found with him for anything." Charles looked up at Alexander, gratitude and something like fatherly respect softening his expression. "You have protected my daughter and this family far beyond what any contract required of you. I do not know how I shall ever repay such kindness." "You need not repay anything," Alexander said, his tone warm despite its usual reserve. "Alina has already given me more than I could ever properly repay in return. Watching over her family is simply an extension of caring for her." They remained in London only long enough to ensure Charles's continued security before returning to Ravenscroft Manor, the threat of Edmund Caro finally, truly behind them. As their carriage rolled once more through the familiar gates of the estate, Alina felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her, the kind of peace that comes only after a long, uncertain battle has finally been won. That evening, as the household settled into quiet contentment, Alexander led Alina out to the garden once more, the same roses that had witnessed his proposal now in full summer bloom, fragrant and vibrant beneath the gathering stars. He turned to her beneath the darkening sky, taking both her hands in his. "When I first agreed to this marriage, I believed I was simply fulfilling a practical arrangement, securing an heir and a companion for social appearances, nothing more," he said softly. "I never imagined I would find in the process a reason to feel truly alive again. You have given me back everything the fire took from me 3 years ago, Alina. Not by replacing what I lost, but by teaching me that my heart was capable of loving again, fully and completely, despite everything it had endured. And you have given me a family beyond anything I imagined when I walked into this house as a frightened stranger," Alina replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. "You have shown me that love born from necessity can grow into something far deeper and more enduring than love that begins with grand romantic gestures. We built this, Alexander, piece by piece, through honesty and trust, and choosing one another again and again, even when it would have been easier not to." Alexander drew her close, resting his forehead against hers beneath the summer stars. "Then let us continue building it, Alina, for the rest of our lives. Whatever challenges may come, I know now with absolute certainty that facing them beside you is the only life I truly want." He kissed her then, slow and tender beneath the open sky, a kiss that held none of the desperation of survival or the fear of loss that had once defined their earliest days together, but only the quiet, steady certainty of a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger for every trial it endured. Alina melted into his embrace, feeling in that perfect moment that she had truly found her way home. Months later, when word reached them that Henry had been accepted into a fine school in London, and Grace had grown into a bright, happy child no longer burdened by fear for her family's future, Alina understood fully the weight of the sacrifice she had made on that cold morning so long ago, and how completely it had transformed into the greatest blessing of her life. She had married a duke to rescue her family from ruin, believing she was trading her own happiness for their safety. Instead, she had found a partner who cherished her completely, a family healed of old grief, and a home filled, at long last, with warmth, laughter and love that neither time nor scandal could ever again threaten to take away. 2 years passed at Ravenscroft Manor, and the estate that had once stood cold and silent now echoed with a warmth few who remembered its earlier years could have imagined possible. The gardens Elinor had first tended with careful, hopeful hands bloomed more magnificently each season, and the small room behind the library, once sealed away in grief, now stood open, its shelves holding not only the memory of Charlotte and her daughter, but new joy as well, for Elinor and Alexander had welcomed a son of theirs on the previous spring, a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's warm, steady eyes. Alexander had changed in ways the entire household noticed and cherished. The stern, guarded Duke who rarely smiled had become a man who laughed often, who knelt in the nursery each evening to read to his son, who walked the gardens hand in hand with his wife without any thought of the appearances that had once governed his every movement. Grief had not vanished from him entirely, nor did Elinor ever wish it to, for it remained a part of the man she loved, a testament to a devotion that had once nearly broken him. But it no longer ruled him. It simply lived quietly alongside the joy he had rebuilt, proof that love, once lost, could indeed be found again without erasing what came before. Charles Whitmore visited often, no longer the broken man who had once been unable to meet his daughter's eyes across a drawing room. He had rebuilt his own life slowly, taking modest employment managing accounts for a merchant in the county, determined never again to place his family in the danger his weaknesses had once caused. Henry excelled at his studies in London, writing long, enthusiastic letters home about his ambitions to study law, determined to build a life of his own making. Grace, now a young lady of 11, spent her summers at Ravenscroft Manor, chasing her nephew through the gardens and filling the halls with laughter that reminded Elinor, every single day, of exactly what she had fought so hard to protect. Lord Edmund Carow was never seen in their circles again. Word eventually reached the manor that he had been forced to sell his remaining properties to settle his mounting debts, retreating to a quiet, diminished life far from London society, his schemes and desperation finally catching up to consequences he could no longer escape. Elinor felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only quiet relief that the shadow he had once cast over her family's happiness had finally, completely lifted. On a warm evening in early summer, Elinor stood once more in the garden where Alexander had first given her his grandmother's ring, watching him carry their young son on his shoulders across the lawn, both of them laughing at some private joke only fathers and small sons seemed to share. She thought back often to that frightened young woman who had once stood trembling in the entrance hall of this very manor, prepared to sacrifice her future for her family's survival, never imagining the depth of happiness that sacrifice would eventually deliver her toward instead. She had believed on her wedding day that she was walking into a life of quiet endurance beside a stranger who would never truly know her. Instead, she had found in Alexander Blackwood a partner who understood her more completely than she had ever believed possible, a man who had taught her that even the coldest hearts carry warmth beneath their careful walls, waiting patiently for someone brave enough and patient enough to help them find their way back into the light. As the sun set gently over Ravenscroft Manor that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose, Alexander returned to her side, their son now sleepy and content against his shoulder, and wrapped his free arm around Elinor's waist, drawing her close as they watched the day fade together. "Do you remember," Elinor asked softly, "the first evening I arrived here, so frightened of the life I believed I had traded my future for?" "I remember," Alexander said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I remember thinking I had married a stranger who would never truly know the man behind this title, and being entirely, wonderfully wrong." "We built something neither of us expected," Elinor said, resting her head against his shoulder as their son slept peacefully between them. "A marriage that began as rescue, and became, somehow, the truest home either of us has ever known." "It became home," Alexander agreed quietly, "the moment you refused to let me hide from you any longer. You did not simply rescue your family that day, Elinor. You rescued me as well, though I did not yet understand how deeply I needed saving until you had already begun to do it." They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by roses in full bloom, their son sleeping peacefully in his father's arms, the manor behind them glowing warm with candlelight, no longer a monument to old grief, but a living, breathing home built on love that had grown stronger through every trial it faced. Whatever challenges the years ahead might still bring, Alina knew, with the same unshakable certainty that had carried her through every hardship before this moment, that she and Alexander would face them exactly as they had faced everything else together, hand in hand, home in one another for as long as they both should live.